So you were mentioning a YouTube channel for the webbing.
Yes. So if you type in strolling under the skin, you can see a really cool video. It's like from the 90s or something like that. But they stick a camera into somebody's arm and to some other body parts as well. And you can see, right, while somebody's moving their fingers, what the fascia really does at like a 3-dimensional level.
Wow.
You can see, the gliding of the tissues and how the tendon, right, goes into the muscle, out of the muscle, so on and so forth. So that kind of gives you like a more of a 3-dimensional look at it. It's very hard to describe, over a podcast.
It makes sense. I mean, these muscles aren't just kind of sitting there and connected. There's actually an encasement to keep them where they're supposed to be, as opposed to just, they're connected, but like moving all over the place, which makes sense. So I got a question though, as someone who's not really deep in it, I'm only just recently, but like fascia has not really been discussed a lot.
Yeah.
So is that I'll call it a new discovery, or is it something that they're realizing the impact, or it was just, it didn't seem like it was as important?
It's a really good question. I've been in a lot of educational classes where people talk about being in a dissection, right? Where you're in front of a cadaver and, hey, this is the sartorius, and these are, right? You're going through all these muscles, and they look at the fascia and they tear it away, and they said, well, we don't really need to worry about this. When in reality, it doesn't make any sense, because you use the word tension, right? Fascia is literally how we have tension in the body. Tension, we can't think of always as a negative connotation, right? Not tension like I'm stressed like this.
Right.
Tension of like literally holding my skeletal system together, right? We see the skeleton and we say, well, that's our structure, but without tension, it'll just collapse, right?
Yeah.
I always give this example. If I jump up and down, right, does that mean my heart goes up into my throat? No, it can't.
Right.
Because it has ligament attachments to our spine, because there's pericardium, which is fascia that connects, right, surrounds our heart and goes to our sternum, right? There's things like that keep a lot of really important things in place.
Almost like a shock absorption system that keeps things in proportion or in the general geography that should stay.
Exactly. So, and even though like, let's say a given piece of fascia is to cover a specific muscle, well, there are fascial links from one joint to another. Okay. So it's kind of this huge, that's why I call it a spider web, this huge system that you can make an argument attaches from the back of our eyeballs all the way down to our big toes. So like when we do something like a hamstring stretch, it doesn't mean, well, I'm just going to straighten out my leg and call it a day, right? Well, you got to make sure that you pull your toes toward your shins. You got to make sure that you create axial extension in the spine, and that'll create the most fascial tension to create the most tension in the fascia that surrounds those hamstrings.
So is that, you kind of mentioned it, but maybe clarify the point. Is that where the tight hamstrings come from? Is it the tight fascia, or a tight low back? Because I'm in we sit all day. We'll unpack that in a little bit, hopefully. But, sitting in a particular form, it gets stuck. Is that more fascia related or muscle related?
Yeah. So the tightness in general will always come from fascia. What's the source of that? I have no idea.
Yeah.
And I say that jokingly, because it could be because you're sitting all day, so your hamstrings are in a shortened position. It could be because posturally you're always leaning forward and you don't know it, so your hamstrings at a very low level are firing.
Right.
It could be because you're super stressed, which constricts the fascia. It could be a lot of different things. Okay.
But so all those are relevant contributing factors that could create tension. Because you hear too, talking about the mind part, maybe is where I heard another guest say the issues are in the tissues, and you were talking about tension, and it's like, you feel yourself crunching over from stress, your shoulders curl over, the correlation between those two, and how even your muscles can hold on to the emotional things in life.
Yeah. So I'll try to touch on that first. And this is a famous Guy Voyer saying, the muscle is a stupid piece of meat. Okay. So the muscle, your brain says, I want you to fire this. So all its job to do is just contract. Right. And then it'll relax, or it'll go into its eccentric contraction. Right. But it's really the fascia that has the intelligence that gives you feedback, right? It can sense pressure, it can sense temperature, right? All those kind of things. And that's what's communicating back up to our nervous system. So the fascia is connected to our emotional system because of its correlation and its connection back up to the brain. So if I'm stressed and I'm getting really wound up, it's actually going to tighten up that fascia. So you go, oh, I hold tension in my neck, right? And that's just a big part because we're actually creating a lot of constriction of that fascia because of our emotional stress on our whole nervous system.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why we end up getting really tense like that. It doesn't come from the muscle, it comes from the fascia.
And then kind of going to your point on interconnectedness of everything, the mind, body, the physical, is like that mental stress, which creates the physical constriction, then can also have a cascading negative effect on other body parts, I would think too. And like that kind of that chain link of our whole system, kind of like the example you gave with the right shoulder and your foot on the left.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, again, everything is a bunch of moving parts that are trying to work synergistically together.
Yeah.
So if I end up even having like a little bit of a hiccup with an ankle sprain, right? It might take 5 or 6 months, but if I don't really treat the tissues around that area, so if I don't treat the foot, if I don't treat the peroneals, the anterior tibialis, the calf muscles, the IT band, what's going to end up happening in about 6 months, if I keep doing what I'm doing, I'll end up with knee issues. And then I'll end up with hip issues. I could end up with back issues, so on and so forth. So totally.
What are some, you kind of touched on one of them, for most of us, the everyday athletes, even if you're a professional athlete, we spend a lot of time sitting, right? We're both doing this right now. I sit in a desk most days for hours. I may be driving for hours on end. So you're in that posture that creates that weakness in the glutes. What is that one, or what other systemic things that we do that we're kind of swimming upstream against? Does that make sense?
Sure. I will try not to go on a big tangent, but there's also another principle called neuroplasticity.
Okay.
Is the idea that our brain is plastic, meaning it can be molded, right? So if I want a really great golf swing, right, and I go out there and I just swing the thing 100 miles an hour, that may not be great for my technique. But if I work with a pro and he says, all right, just these 3 things, just these over. And if I do it over and over again, and even if I'm not getting great results, if I just keep going with that technique over and over again, that builds like what we used to call like muscle memory, right?
Right.
Okay, now I understand that repetition, so on and so forth. So the same thing can be with posture. So I'm just trying to bring that back to now when you talk about sitting all day.
Okay.
If I'm in front of a computer and I'm used to doing this all day, after a while, my brain says, well, that's the way Geoff wants me to sit, so I'm cool with it, right? So your brain loses that awareness of that this is bad posture, and it thinks that this is okay.
So it kind of creates a new normal.
Exactly. So, and by the way, you can make an argument that it doesn't matter what sport you take, you're beating up something in your body.
Yeah.
Golf, tennis, basketball, football, so on and so forth. So
we're like over-indexing in a particular
exactly
way. Like, because I'm a runner, and so certain muscles are overused in that way, and others are underused. And I need to, or any runner has to offset that by taking action on it.
Exactly. And going back to your original point, like what are we facing an uphill battle on? Definitely one thing is like, there's a lot of sedentary jobs nowadays, right? Where we're sitting at a computer. But I'll tell you the next pandemic, if you will, are these guys, are your cell phones. Okay. Especially for the, teenagers right now, kids in high school, kids in grade school, everyone has a phone. And what do we do? Even if we're standing, right? What do? We want to look down at that phone.
Yeah.
Right? And that's going to create compression of the discs. It's going to create that bad neuroplasticity where, right, I don't have awareness that I'm here. It's going to create kyphosis in the back. And so it's going to create all these things that, again, like when you're young and you're healthy, you don't really notice it that much, but it could end up really hurting you when you're in your 40s.
Yeah.
There's some real, I have chronic neck pain. Well, might be end up being because you're so used to doing this for so long.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that because I just saw a post from a friend and a guest that was talking about that same thing and showed, the skeleton forward and how, and probably for anybody, but probably especially for the young youth because they're still developing, that you were talking about the body thinks that that's normal. They're going to stay like that. But also the other aspect that we discussed already was how that's compressing your lungs. So it's reducing the oxygen flow, and that constricts blood flow to the brain that then impacts your emotional response that could drive up anxiety.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
It's amazing and scary at the same time, the like 2 to 3 degrees separation, and how quickly that can pivot to that. Still there.
Hey, Scott.
Hey, all right.
Okay.
I don't
Yeah.
know what's going on. Thankfully, I've got a guy who can edit that out.
Okay.
So you mentioned restorative techniques. Oh,
Looking up again, old Scott.
yeah. Let me see if I can cut off some other things. I don't have anything on, and no one else is home. Still there?
Yeah, yeah. I'm still here.
All right. I'm gonna shut some stuff down. I really don't understand what's happening. It's raining outside.
Oh,
All right. So we've talked about a number of things around a bit of cause, but what are some of the restorative techniques? Maybe touch on one or two, relative to some of the systemic challenges that many of us have in this modern society.
totally. So I think I'll go back to some of the things that we've already touched on, and then I'll talk about things like the ELDOA, which we'd mentioned before, which is so same thing. If we're talking about something like posture, right? And somebody comes in and, this is that forward head, right? We call it upper cross syndrome. Their chest is kind of caved in, so on and so forth. It's literally just taking a look at the structure, okay, and what do I want to reverse, right? So this chest is really tight. We can just think of simple things like, okay, I'm just going to do some myofascial stretching to my chest, right? That sounds really easy. A lot of people can figure that out. But if this is short and tight, then the back muscles that keep us erect, what's happening to them, they're becoming lengthened, right? Like too lengthened. We always think we want long muscles, right? But they're becoming too lengthened to the point, right, where we become a little bit rounded here. So actually what I want to do to those back muscles is I actually want to shorten them. So right, when I do a bicep curl, I want to think of full range of motion. For these muscles back here, I actually want to do a shortened range of motion for them. So we worked a lot of the muscles, right, whether they're the erector muscles, the retractor muscles for the shoulder blade. We actually want to do those in a shortened range of motion in order to create shorter fascia, right? Like tighter fascia, tighter.
Okay.
And that's kind of sounds like counterintuitive to a logical thought process, but from like basic strength and conditioning, but that's actually going to help create synergy between the anterior chain and the posterior chain. So that's one thing, right? Reinforcement, strength training exercises, the myofascial stretching, which we talked about. You can do things like proprioception, which I mentioned before. So there's like exercise you can do for proprioception for the neck. So the problem is with our neck is that our head is in space all day. So it doesn't get any feedback. So like our feet are touching the ground all day. So
Mm-hmm.
therefore there's constant feedback back to the brain. Meanwhile, your head, unless you're staring at a mirror all day, you don't get any feedback. So you can actually use things like the ground in order to give your neck feedback by using your head, right? You basically like roll your head on the ground. I know it seems silly, but to give promote a lot of blood flow to those joints in the neck, but also give the ligaments a lot of feedback. And 9 times out of 10, whether it's shoulder issues, trap tightness, we do neck proprioception, and that stuff goes away. So strength training, myofascial stretching, proprioception, and then lastly, ELDOA.
Okay.
So ELDOA is, this is a lot, but it's a French acronym that stands for longitudinal osteoarticular decoaptation of the spine.
Okay.
And
And just for those listening, ELDOA is ELDOA. If you want to look it up, or some of the links, I'm sure we'll include in the notes here.
yes. And depending on kind of who you talk to, who's been a GI student, some people will say it's a stretching exercise. Some people will say it's a strengthening exercise. When you look at these things, they look like yoga poses that are like, I can do that. But when you have the intention of the exercise, it might be one of the hardest things that you'll ever do. It's incredibly challenging. You can see some of the stuff on my Instagram. You can see some of it on my website. They look like gentle and delicate, but they are really, really hard. Again, because since most of us are used to this lifestyle, we're trying to create maximum extension. It becomes really, really hard. So what does the ELDOA do? It does a ton of things. So what it basically does is you take these postures that put maximum fascial tension on that spine, right? Really in the whole body. What we can do is based on where our arms are, where our legs are, so on and so forth, we can actually pinpoint a specific junction in the spine. So whether that's L5S1 or whether that's T8, T9, whether that's a cervical one, C2, C3, we can actually create a specific posture to create maximum tension in that one area.
Okay.
Now, when you do that, let's say you have a bulging disc at L5S1, right? So that disc is just slightly sitting out of where it's supposed to be sitting, directly under the vertebrae body, right? And so what we do is when we do this, when we create that maximum tension, we're creating a suction mechanism because you have cerebral spinal fluid that's flowing up and down that canal, and it actually pulls it to that one area.
Okay.
Push that disc back into place. So
Wow.
you can reverse bulging discs. You can help restore herniations, right? Herniations is when the nucleus pulposus is spilled out. You can help pull that back in. You can also, right, the discs that sit in between our vertebrae are water soluble. So you can actually make yourself taller.
Really?
Absolutely. So you ever noticed, I don't know if you ever noticed this before, like you get out of bed and you start walking around, and you're like, man, I feel tall. That's usually when we're tallest throughout the day because we haven't had gravity on us all night. Right. And so our discs overnight, because they're not taking on any compact, they can actually absorb more fluid and they can get taller. In total, our discs make up 25% of our total spine height. So you can legitimately make somebody taller. You know, they say, when you get old, you get shorter.
Yeah.
It's true because it happens, but it doesn't have to be. What happens over time is just, right, our discs start to degenerate. They obtain less fluid. So if you can help those discs absorb as much fluid as possible, you can regain height.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And sorry, two more things, because I know I'm going to.
Sure. No.
We talked about the neuroplasticity, right?
Sure.
So what the ELDOA does, because you're using fascia, because you're using muscle, that sends signals back to the brain of, oh, wow, I can attain this. I can do this. And this is how Geoff wants me to hold myself, right? It would be like squatting. If I squatted with my head forward, right, my brain's going to remember that's how Geoff wants my head. If I squat with axial extension, my brain's going to remember, I'm reinforcing this is how Geoff wants me to hold my head. So the same thing is with the ELDOA. The more and more I do it, the more neurological awareness I create of my posture.
That makes sense, especially when you've been doing systemically incorrect and then you try to do something like that. You know, I remember in CrossFit, like it felt awkward, but they're like, no, you're actually in the right position. And I'm holding a bar where it's supposed to be, but like my back was screaming at me saying, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
Really, it's like my back was so used to being the opposite direction that, you know, it was just like not liking that move at all.
Sure. No, definitely. Definitely. And I think the really cool thing about it is obviously your podcast is about recovery and that sort of thing. Is this is really fantastic stuff. Like if you do those endurance sports like running, like cycling, so on and so forth, it can really create a lot of space in your spine. That's what it's designed to do, is create space. But anything from like football, where you're creating a lot of compaction, so on and so forth, it'll help kind of reverse how much you beat yourself up in those sports. But honestly, it'll keep you aligned, right? Especially at like L5S1 is the most important, right? Where your sacrum is meeting your last lumbar.
Yeah.
Right? It'll keep your pelvis aligned. And the more aligned you are, the more synergistic you are, the better your performance.
So unpack that a little bit more and why that's such a big area. And it seems both from an importance, but also it seems the area most influenced negatively based on our modern society. And maybe I'm wrong on that.
Sure. So at my facility, somebody new walks in 9 times out of 10. Okay, I pull their legs right next to each other, and I see that one leg is longer than the other. Okay. Most of us walking around, we have that. Okay. It happens. And it doesn't mean that, oh, well, this femur is longer than that femur. It just means that your pelvis is slightly off. And so that's common again from, let's just take tennis. That's a really easy example, but I'm going to hit more forehands than my backhand, right? In tennis. So I keep driving off. So that can create a little bit of imbalance in my pelvis. Basketball players, right? If they're right-handed, they jump more off their left. That can create a little bit of imbalance. Like there's a lot of things. Don't cross your legs at work. That can be another thing that can create an imbalance in the pelvis. So there's a lot of things that can happen in that stance. And again, neurologically, whether it's from sports from a kid or whatever it is, we probably don't notice it, but we always have one leg that's a little bit more dominant than the other, that becomes more of a driver, that we push off a little bit more. So that can also create an imbalance in the pelvis.
Okay.
And so going back to the performance part, with things like stretching to make sure that there's balance in the pelvis, strengthening, whether it's to make sure that there's balance in the low abs, balance in the glutes, both hip flexors have the same tension, so on and so forth. When you create balance there, you create really good, even tension. Okay. And what I mean by that is, picture a rubber band, and I'm pulling that rubber band apart. I have way more force involved if I have forces going in two opposite directions, right? We call it like pre-tension. Versus if one side of that rubber band were to stay and I only pulled one side, I'm not going to get as much force as I would if I pulled both.
Okay.
When you talk about overall tension, we want it to be synergistic, meaning we don't want one side more dominant than the other.
That makes sense. So positionally, how should our hips align? Like for me, I noticed my back is sticking out a little bit, and what my research, it should almost be like straight, right? Like tucked under. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, like, so interior tilt of the pelvis.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about. Yeah. So it's a really good question. I think sometimes we're like trying to overcorrect of like, you really need to be in retroversion of the pelvis all the time. That's not really true either. But what you can see very obvious in some people when they walk is that clearly their hips are almost sitting behind their entire center of gravity. And that's bad.
Okay.
Because now you're putting like almost too much extension on that lumbar spine, and that's going to create some wear and tear on those discs, and that'll start to create some degeneration. So, and again, when you go back to things like if we're sitting a lot, so on and so forth, like our pelvis seems to get in that position a lot just from those hip flexors constantly being shortened, so on and so forth. So that's a great thing that we can do with exercise, right? Is we can change that tension by strengthening up those glutes, stretching out those hip flexors, and that'll help put your pelvis in the proper direction.
And so, and keep me honest, going back to the neuro piece of it, you also have all the nerves associated. If you're pinching that disc, that could have other impacts as well, nerve related. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. So, and this is really big in osteopathy, is that a big message is that structure dictates function. So all of our organs have ligament attachments to our spine. So if our, let's say, like take like our bladder, for example, right? It attaches at the lumbar spine. If our lumbar spine is out of whack, it's going to affect how our bladder functions. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
So, you're not just talking about like, how do I perform or how do I feel, but you're literally talking about how your nervous system works and how your organs function.
Yeah. I mean, that's an important thing especially as we get older and that compression and that correlation causation. Are you actually having bladder issues, or is there other things deeper into your body, like the nerves, like the positioning of your spine, that are actually impacting? Could be both, right? But you could also lessen the impact, it sounds like, by applying these methodologies on a more consistent basis, or in acknowledging that piece.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So what have I missed so far? Because I only know so much.
No, I think those are kind of the players in the game.
Yeah.
The idea is, how do you use it?
Right.
So, what I'm tasked with is, some people only have once a week that they can see me, right? So I'm going to sit here and say, okay, I'm just going to beat the heck out of your discrepancies, right? You're weak here, you're tight here. When I'm with you, you're going to get the most out of me. I'm going to work those guys as much as we can. Mm-mm. And I've got to give you homework. It's like, if I want bigger biceps, right? I can't just do bicep curls once a week and expect that my biceps are going to get bigger, right?
Right.
The same thing, if I'm fighting pain or an imbalance somewhere, I have to do something kind of every day, because again, that's going to reinforce the neuroplasticity. That's going to give a lot of demand to the muscle fibers, which will stimulate a lot of blood flow, which will bring nutrients and oxygen. So that's really the challenge, right? Is like, how do you make time? And so what I've really tried to do, especially in the last few years, is say, okay, time is of the essence. I know that people have me scheduled, whether it's for 1 hour a week, 2 hours a week, or 3 hours a week, but how can I make it a part of their lifestyle to take 5 minutes when they wake up? Hey, Scott, here are the 3 things I want you to do when you wake up. Just do these things and I'll put you in a really good position for the rest of your day. And then what can I give you to do 5 minutes before you go to sleep?
Okay.
So, like, believe it or not, the ELDOA is a great time to do before you go to bed, because if you think about it, it's pulling in that cerebrospinal fluid, right? And then if I go right into bed, I don't have gravity pushing on me, right? So that fluid's now going to stay there, and it's going to make that area a lot healthier.
And around rest and recovery, I mean, we mentioned blood flow, and it seems like everything leans back to that. When you open up those pathways, you're allowing more blood flow, which enhances the recovery because it's bringing all that nutrients to those areas to better position you for that next day. And then, like you said, the morning. And I like the fact that you mentioned it in the morning and the evening, because you can kind of habit stack that, right? Or make it part of your bedtime routine.
Absolutely.
To wake up. And it kind of makes sense too. If you're talking about blood flow and nerve, opening it up first thing in the morning, you want to be alert, want to be able to have a good day. So that makes a lot of sense.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. And that's the really hard part, right? Is building those habits. So it's not a habit, it's a routine, right? Like,
right.
This is what I do.
It's a way of life. This is
way of life. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you address it with, because whether it's this or just about any activity, even for folks active, I'm presuming you're still pretty active. I'm still pretty active. There's still a lot of things I don't do, to include some of the things you're really talking about around my posture and lower back. So how do you help coach, or what are some things that you help cross that,
You're asking a really good question, and my basketball background might be able to help me there. It's really hard, but what you have to tap into, like as a coach, as a practitioner, whatever it is like what is important to Scott, right? It's like what are the things that make you tick? And I just say that like when I was recruiting in basketball, I learned this saying or this technique: build the gate. Okay, so I want to build a gate around Scott that's important to Scott. So family is important, continuous learning is important, right? All of those things, that's what I want to hold on to. Mm-hmm. So for my clients, it's like, me going for a run, that's my stress relief. So it's my job to say, hey, you want to keep running? Do X, Y, and Z, and that's going to keep you running. I want to play with my grandkids. You want to play with your grandkids? Okay, you got to be in shape for this, that, and the other. Let's do these things, and I promise you, it's going to get you there. That's the really hard part, but you got to figure out how to tug on those strings and people to be bought in. And for where I am, I'm very lucky that I have a lot of people that are like type A personalities. They're go-getters. They want to get things done. So it works. It works a lot. But yeah, sadly, that's the way it's got to be. I mean, you're running this amazing podcast talking about health, wellness, and recovery, right? Like we're not talking about pills and we're not talking about cutting people open.
Right.
And sadly, that's kind of, we get lazy and we're like, well, I can go see a doctor and maybe he can give me some medication for it. It's like, sadly, you got to work for these things. It's really, really hard.
Yeah. Or, that knee surgery could be avoided potentially because through other means that may take longer and it's not going to be an overnight success, but it'll be positive investment in the long run.
Absolutely.
The positive, I don't want to say the positive. The good thing is most of us are in that same boat. We all have those areas. So the good thing is then you can hopefully find community and folks like yourself to kind of help facilitate along and have that long view. I think the longevity piece of really shifting so that we can kind of do that. I'll call it the pennies add up to dollars mindset of just building towards where we want to go.
Definitely. Yeah, that's right. Little investments will make a huge difference down the line.
Yeah, it's that compounding interest principle.
That's right. Time. No, it's true. It's true.
All right. So what have I missed? Did I miss anything else? Or I know I asked that question already, but.
No, I think that's it. We just put a lot of little things taken from different sections of education and try to put it together. And even for someone like myself, like I keep learning, I just make sure I keep taking different courses and trying to see someone else's perspective to say, what are my weaknesses? What can I work on to better help my clientele?
Great. So, Geoff, I appreciate the insights. Like you said, there's a lot of information in a little time, but where can folks learn more about you?
So I have an Instagram profile, Rep Athletics NY. I have a website, repathleticsco.com. And that's where you can find the most information about me. I do have to make a plug for you. I'm coming out with an app that's launching this month. And really the idea is to kind of get this ELDOA out to the world. You will find that we are a little cult. There is a very small number of us that are certified in ELDOA, that really know ELDOA. And so it's getting out there. There's a lot of guys out in California who've worked with the 49ers now use it. The Kansas City Chiefs use the ELDOA. There's like 7 MLB teams. There's a handful of NHL teams that are using ELDOA. So it's getting out there. But I'm coming out with an app that's going to have a lot of rehab exercises, a lot of protocols for back pain, for runner's knee. Mm-hmm. And it's going to include the rehab exercises, the myofascial stretching, and the ELDOA.
That's awesome. I know I will be looking forward to that one because I think it was offline, but that L5S1 is a personal gift for me for entirely too long. And it's, I do all the things and it just goes right back. And So I'm looking forward to giving some of these things a try and see what kind of progress. I think it's pretty fascinating too that you can be that specific in a particular joint area that to kind of really dial in.
Totally. Yeah. It's true and it's real. It's true and it's real.
That's awesome. Well, I like to close things out with a couple of questions, personal questions, 3 actually. What are you reading right now?
I am reading, of course, I actually can't remember the name of it. I'm reading a new dad book. I'm an expecting father.
Congratulations.
So that's what I have my nose buried deep in. So.
Good idea. Good idea. Awesome. Well, congratulations and welcome to, or almost welcome to fatherhood.
Yes.
What are you listening to right now, be it music or podcast?
So my favorite podcast is The Drive by Peter Attia. He is just like, and I mean this in the most complimentary way, he is super geeky.
Yeah.
He just dives into really cool stuff like cardiovascular health, blood sugar issues, neurological stuff. Like he's got it all going on, and he has some really, really smart guests on. So that's my favorite podcast I listen to. As far as music goes, I have a really eclectic taste. I'm all over the place. Alan Stone, John Mayer,
Cool.
way to some rap and R&B and stuff like that. So.
Awesome. Diversity is good in music. I love all kinds as well.
Yeah.
So what is your go-to rest and recovery method?
ELDOA. ELDOA. You know, there are even things like L5S1 where the posture is your legs are up the wall. And honestly, at night, I put I'm either reading my book or I put my blue light glasses on. I'm on my phone. I hang out in that position for about 5 minutes, and then I go ahead and I do the ELDOA. So,
Okay.
It's a good challenge, but it's also, again, it's super restorative and it clears your mind. That's for sure. It clears your mind.
That sounds like a good way to get the physical and mental connection there too, kind of habit stacking again.
Yes, totally.
Awesome. Well, Geoff, thank you so much for your time, insight, expertise. Look forward to seeing where it goes. And I know I've benefited from it already. Or will in the immediate term, because I'm about to go do something about it, and hopefully those listening will as well.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me, Scott.